The other day, the Quebec provincial government confirmed that they are going ahead with one of their campaign promises to implement a citizenship values test for newcomers to their province. This is going to commence on January 1st. It'll be 20 multiple choice questions. They're going to have to get 75% right if they want to pass. If they fail, they get to do it again. And if they fail that time, you have to go and sit in a Quebec values course, an in-person instruction to learn the Quebec values. The premier is pretty unapologetic and pretty nonchalant about it. He says, if you want to live here in the long term, you got to learn Quebec's values. Quite frankly, this is not a big deal. As I've written before a couple years ago, Northern European countries do this to quite a degree. Countries that are generally held up as progressive nations, they do it successfully. Nobody's complaining. And you know what? Nobody's actually complaining that Quebec is planning to do it now. And yet just 2 years ago, we had massive outcry about how intolerant and awful this whole thing was during the Conservative leadership campaign when Kellie Leitch proposed the idea. I remember the very day she proposed the idea, and I looked at it and I thought, this is actually pretty reasonable. And then she appeared on my radio program the next day and she said part of what she wants to do is bring up the fact that here in Canada we have women's rights, we have gay rights, we have tolerance for other religions and other ethnicities, and pointed out that to some people coming from certain countries, they don't have it like that, so it just makes sense to instruct them to that new reality when they come here. Basically a lay of the land, this is how things work in Canada, just so you know. And when I heard it that first day, I said, you know, this is going to have massive support. I mean, this is going to get majority support in Canada. Sure enough, it did. 3/4 of Canadians support it, according to a number of polls. One CBC poll actually put the support level in the 80s. 80% and more actually supported this. But this did not stop people from defaming, libeling, vilifying Kellie Leitch in really awful ways that I think she is still owed an apology by many people to this day. Quite frankly, the idea of a values test, it's just not that big of a deal, really. I mean, we already do similar things like this when people get their citizenship, different tests. You ask them about Canada, the history of Canada. The questions change over the year. There were some concerns that Justin Trudeau had watered it down a bit, and he did. But so what? I mean, it's not a big deal in many respects. It's not offensive, it's not intolerant, and it's also not a magic bullet solution to integration and social cohesion. Just because someone can pass a test like this doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the perfectly integrated individual, and if they fail at it, it doesn't mean they're going to be an awful addition to society either. It is just one of many possible things that can be done for integration. I'm actually kind of agnostic about it. I mean, I support Quebec doing it, and I think we should consider doing it across the rest of Canada, but I also just don't think it's a hill to die on. It's not that big of a deal, and it's certainly not worth vilifying people over. One example of questions that the Quebec government released is they say, all right, here's a couple illustrations of marriages. Which ones are allowed in Canada? And then they show opposite-sex couples, a man and a woman married. They show same-sex couples. They show 2 guys. They show 2 women. And then they show a couple polygamous arrangements, a man with 2 women and a woman with 2 men. And they ask which one of these is acceptable in Canada. And it's actually a good question to ask people. 2 of the top immigration source countries for Quebec are Algeria and Morocco. Now, those countries, they do not have same-sex marriage. In fact, same-sex relationships in and of themselves are illegal in those countries, but they do allow polygamous marriages. So it's a complete 180 for how things work here. So people coming from those countries to Quebec, I mean, you just gotta let them know that it's the complete opposite, to spare them the culture shock, and also because, well, they don't know. This is not how things operate. Maybe some of them do know, and that's the exact reason they want to go from those countries to Quebec, but others maybe go, oh, I like how things work traditionally in my country. I hope it works that way in Quebec, and then they learn, oh, it does not. And it's responsible, just on all different levels, to tell them about that, to tell them these differences. Frankly, it was reckless of the media to make a big stink out of Kellie Leitch's idea. I'm glad to see they're not making a big stink out of the idea right now, because the hypocrisy sure is glaring. But the thing Quebec's doing, well, the rest of Canada, pay attention to it. Watch it after it's been implemented for 6 months or a year or 2 years, and then other provinces or the federal government can decide if they want it for themselves as well.